You may not realize it, but how we learn is just as important as what we learn. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't get the training we need to teach people or to learn ourselves a better way. But Gregg Goodhart, he's the Roy Acuff Chair of Excellence in the Creative Arts, is working to help change that. Welcome to 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. I'm Micca Terrell. Joining us again is Gregg Goodhart, and he's an educator who's been teaching more than 30 years, also survived high school music teaching as well. Gregg has so much great information to share with us. Gregg, thanks so much for stopping by with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So how did you go from high school music teacher to an educator who's found this great way to connect people with facts and help them learn more efficiently?
Well, that actually is a little bit of an interesting story. I'm as surprised as anyone that some dopey recovering high school music teacher figured this out. That's how easy it is to find the information. It's also how hard it is to find the information. So around 2000, I started teaching at a high school, and it became imperative for me to figure out how people learn. I don't have a degree in education. I have a master's degree in classical guitar performance. And I'll mention right at the outset that this isn't just for music, it's for everything. But music was a real perfect place to learn this, because there are no errors in music. You cannot perform at 95%. That's great on a math test, but it does not work when you're playing in front of people if you can't play 5% of everything you're playing. So music has this kind of higher level of expectation, which is why people practice for hours and hours all the time. And so I had to get kids ready to perform. I had a beginning class, and this was a serious classical guitar class, in which I could accept anybody. And so I had to figure out what the average untalented, this is back when I thought talent was a big deal, what could the average untalented student do? And that would be my requirements, because it would be unfair for me to expect of everyone what the talented students could do. I spent 5 years seriously looking for talent, and I couldn't find it. What I found was when the students did certain things, they got good at music, and when they didn't get good at music. So I started compiling those things, finding different things that work. It was a years-long investigation. And then right around as I got to year 10, I started to really figure out the things that work, really unusual things. Like, you want to make things more difficult. I found it was called contextual interference, to produce something called desirable difficulty, which makes you reload information to get better at it instead of just repeating it. I'll give you an example in academics. Word problems in math. They're not there to torture us. They are actually producing contextual interference. If we understand getting worse at something and then figuring out again is the way to learn something better, and I just got back from West Creek High School where I forced them to get worse at stuff, and then they got way better. And I'd find these things, and I remember I called it the burn of learning, like weightlifting, and I feel the blurn. I'm really into the blurn, because you really have to encourage people at first because they don't want to get worse, because we teach people erroneously that if you're getting worse at something, your learning method isn't working. That's not true in most cases if you do it in a prescribed way. And then in 2010, I read my favorite book of all time. If you read one book the rest of your life, other than the book of your religion, it should be Talent is Overrated by Jeff Colvin. And he laid out the arguments. Mozart didn't have anything special but a particular situation. Tiger Woods didn't have anything special but a particular situation. And then he went into deliberate practice, which I think many of us have heard about. And I started, and it's hard, there's books written about it and people can't figure it out. When I married that up with all the things I figured out, there was a perfect union. And so, because I was forced to get good, because I needed people to be, I was forced to get other people good at something that's hard to do, because I knew I'd be called to the mat by the parents if I didn't do it right.
Right.
So I had that pressure on me. I needed to get it right. I needed to know that what I was doing would work 100% of the time. That way when I graded, I could see, I don't get the argument, which I used to get, but I just don't have the talent to do it. That's how I ended up here. The portal was, and I want everyone to know that it's okay that it's hard to start to learn this stuff, even if we've been educated as teachers. I do professional development for academic teachers all the time who don't realize this. It's okay. When I first heard about this deliberate practice, I wanted to recommend the book to everyone I knew. I was a department chair. I said, I'm not going to do that just because a book says it. So I read the deliberate practice study. One study. It took me 2 weeks.
Wow.
Lots of words I didn't understand. And that was my intro. It was hard at first, and then the study demanded that I read other studies underneath it. And that's how I got there. And it's just been years. To this day, I read cognitive science on an almost daily basis. It's fascinating.
And it is. And talk a little bit about that deliberate practice and how teachers can help you and help them, student to have that practice that's not just helpful, but also a helpful learning kind
I
of
should have
tool.
brought my little index card with me that I always use that has the process. So it always seems kind of complex, this whole deliberate practicing. What do I do? And we talk about, well, you have to push and push really hard and try for a new level. Listen, there's a 3-step process to break this down, that if you'll apply it all the time, you'll be in deliberate practice. It looks like a triangle with arrows pointing to each corner of the triangle, and the words are plan, do, and reflect.
Right.
The reflect then helps you make a plan. So if you're doing your homework, if you're practicing an instrument, you make a plan. I'm going to do something. Then you do it. Then, as soon as you complete it, you reflect upon what you did. Is it right? Am I sure? Is there anything could be better? Now, how many of us do that? Okay, almost nobody.
Right.
That's the missing piece. What we usually do is plan, do, plan, do, plan, do with no real direction. In music, I call this play and pray practice. You just get into a room and do something, and then you hope that it works out. So if you're doing this reflection, then making a plan, your plan doesn't even have to work. It doesn't matter. If it's terrible and there's not 20 ways not to do it, you're down to 19. Keep going. That's how, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. And then the last piece I would say is you have to realize during the do phase, it requires something most people don't do, and it requires a little training. That is metacognition, thinking about your thinking. I didn't know what this was called when I started. I'd say just use guided feedback, focus, and we're all telling people that. But there's a scientific process that we can break down into these steps and get people to do it. The metacognition is thinking while you're doing. 2 things happen when I make people do this. One of 2 things. One, they start screwing up like crazy because their working memory is occupied with paying attention. And I praise them for this. This is great. Who cares if it makes it a little worse? Now you're seeing truly what you can do when you think, and it very quickly gets better when they identify the problem spots and work on them. Is my finger too far this way? Was my answer in the math problem 1 number off? Well, if so, maybe I should figure out how to get my finger that way. If it goes too far, then I adjust. But this thinking while doing is not easy for people. And it's not something, and I think this is where we really miss it, that you can tell someone once. It's like learning mathematics. It's like learning history. It's like learning an instrument. You go back and over, you check, you refine, and it gets better and better and faster. Nowadays, I can do deliberate practice in a matter of seconds. I can evaluate, but I will tell you, 10 minutes in doing something, sometimes I'm not focusing.
Right. And
Right.
so how do you, so you catch yourself. So that's
Very much so.
Very much so.
Well, one thing, I meditate, and you catch yourself when you're not focusing. Meditation is a really good thing. But you don't have to meditate to be able to do this. You do have to be aware, and as you're aware, sometimes it will go on for a minute, sometimes it will go on for 10, and here's what I do. When I'm doing work, and I find out I'm not practicing, I've got a couple options. I can try to refocus. Sometimes that doesn't work. Don't do homework, don't practice through mental fatigue. And if you start doing deliberate practice, mental fatigue will start to happen much earlier than you're used to. How do we know mental fatigue? When you start to try and do something and you've been able to do it before. Well, I'm just going to go back and do this process. I'll get the first 2 steps I can do easy, and then the third, and you can't even get started with the first. We've all had that happen, right? And you're like, why can't I do this? That's mental fatigue. You need a break. I really want to emphasize that recovery periods, which is what they're called in the literature, taking real breaks, not a break where you move to other work, but eating a sandwich, answering your texts, are great. Please don't take the wrong message, people, that you should be answering your texts while you're doing homework and practicing. That's not what this is. That's after a period of time when you reach mental exhaustion. You either try to refocus. When that doesn't work, I need a little break. A minute, 3 minutes. When that doesn't work, I need a longer break. 30 minutes, an hour, do something different. Go get lunch. When that doesn't work, I need a night of sleep.
But recognizing that is the key, right? So
and it's a skill.
Yeah.
You have to develop it. You'll see the nuance as you do it more. I really want to emphasize everyone's going to be terrible at this when they start. That is not an indication you don't have talent. It's not an indication you can't do it. It's an indication you're learning to do it. And unfortunately, in our education system, we have a paradigm which says if you're not getting better right now, something's wrong with the method that you're using. And so you need to abandon it. And we get rid of all these great methods because we don't get benefit right now. That's not when the benefit needs to happen. The benefit needs to happen on performance night, on test day. That's when the benefit needs to happen. And you can You can not emulate that. You can do a kind of a mock of that by giving low stakes quizzes. And then that's retrieval practice, which is something I'd love to talk about. But that's what's going on. And in fact, Robert Bjork, the eminent researcher, him and his wife Elizabeth at UCLA, were asked in a podcast, what's the biggest problem in education? And without hesitation, he said, judging your learning in the moment.
Definitely. Now, if you're just tuning in, I'm Micca Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs, and we are speaking with Gregg Goodhart. He is a great learning coach and also the Acuff Chair of Excellence here at Austin Peay. And he's telling us about revolutionary ideas to help us learn better and to be better teachers too. So we talked a little bit about you mentioned talent, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about talent. So there's talent versus skill. Can you talk about that and how people kind of misunderstand what talent is?
Well, people think there is a talent versus skill. It's really talent is skill. Anytime you hear the word talent, replace it with the word skill. Boy, that baseball team has a talented outfield. Boy, that baseball team has a skilled outfield. We think of skill as something you can build. Talent is really a great compliment. When someone wants to tell me you're very talented when I play somewhere, what they mean is you're so amazingly skilled that I feel compelled to tell you about how much I enjoy it. What a compliment. However, for some reason the word comes pregnant with the idea that you got it somehow magically and you didn't have to work as hard as others. Listen, I can tell you, I worked as hard as anyone. In fact, I worked harder because I didn't know how to do this in the beginning and didn't get as good as I wanted. That's what compelled me to find this. And when you really think about it, right, we say we want to identify talent, right? Let's be positive and find people with talent. Well, what's the percentage of people we think have talent? It's not a lot. I don't know. I don't know. I've never seen surveys, but it's very few. And so we tell all our kids in anything, music and academics, I want you to go home. I want you to do your homework. I want you to focus. I want you to try hard. I want you to really get the answers. I want you to pay attention and ask questions. And in a couple of months, we'll see if you have any talent in any of these subjects. How in the world can someone discipline themselves to do that if they don't know it's going to work? Now, if that's the truth, that's okay. Always tell the truth about learning. That's a mindset issue. Always tell the truth, but it's not. We can always get better. The idea that it's some sort of gift is a myth, and once we learn how to do the deliberate practice and other things like contextual interference and retrieval practice, that kind of disappears. But it takes a while. It's a very deep-seated myth that we have, and there are people watching this right now that will get kind of upset. How can that possibly be true? Check your information. See if it's circumstantial. Look at the science, and then try to do some of the things that I teach and see what happens.
Right.
And you can remember as much stuff as you want for tests, for instance.
Exactly. And that failing is, again, and I'm glad that you touched on that you learn through recognizing mistakes. So it's important to do that. So Gregg, I wanted to ask you real quick because we're running out of time. What else did you want to share with us before we go today?
Well, I'll share some other elements. What you talked about there with making mistakes, that's not just some philosophical thing. That's not just some philosophical thing like, oh, you'll make mistakes, feel better about it. You have to make mistakes to learn. There's something called contextual interference, where you want to take what you've learned and make it harder, like word problems in math. Memorize the Declaration of Independence, the preamble from the Constitution. Well, that's fine. Learn every other word. Make it harder, and it'll be better to recall. And retrieval practice. Once you learn something, don't repeat it a bunch of times. Repeat it once every 5 or 10 minutes. Even if you get it wrong, the testing effect, look it up, the testing effect says that even if you get it wrong, you're more likely to get it right the next time. Wrong doesn't mean you don't know it. It means it's in your memory and you can't get it out. How many of us practice anything that are tests that way? These are some of the crazy things that work incredibly well. I could talk for an hour. That.
I'm sure we would love to have you back again when you come back to visit. So again, I'm Micca Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. We're speaking with Gregg Goodhart. He's the Roy Acuff Chair from Austin Peay's Center of Excellence. Thank you so much for stopping by. www.gregggoodhart.com is where you can find more information about Gregg's really interesting information. And of course, we'll share that with y'all on our social platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So thank you so much.
Micca.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much. And y'all have a great day. Thanks.